Okay, here I am at my studio, and I've put together a series of white objects, white and brown paper, and you can see that the window is lighting most of the objects. There are a couple of things that I want to talk about. One is that when you make your arrangements, you're looking for positive and negative shapes. For example, I'm finding very nice little negative shape right in here that's between the shadows, and more shapes right along in here. I'm finding some interesting negative shapes in and around here. And you can just generally see that there's patterns of lights and darks. It's not that you can see a vase that's isolated or an object that's isolated. Everything is kind of integrated into shapes. This is what you're going to try and do with your objects. And then I want you to be able to look up and start to notice how the patterns change and start to look at things that you might take advantage of. For example, in this particular place, I like very much this shape. I think that this is interesting, but I could take and move this so that this shadow now connects here, and now I have a more specific shape here and here that's slightly different, and in my mind, a little bit more exciting. To take it all the way down maybe is a little unnatural, but I think I'm going to do something like that versus something like that. Either of those are good, but I just want you to see why I might have made that change, because now I have this shape, which I think is more interesting. So right here I have two objects that are in shadow. The light is coming off from the right. There's some reflections on this, and that's tempting. Everybody loves to paint the reflections, but we're not going to pay attention to the reflections right now. What I'm looking at is these two objects and how they're lined up. And that if I move my head slightly to the left, if I move my head slightly to the right, the arrangement changes just a little bit. It's almost the same if I move my head. It's almost the same as me moving this object here, here, or here. So why would I think about any of these more subtle arrangements? Well, one of the things I'd like to do is take advantage of a dark that shows a light. In the earlier conversation, I talked a little bit about shapes and advantageous shapes, things that were a little bit more interesting, perhaps. In this case, I want to talk a little bit about being able to see the light shining on an object by making use of a shadow. So for example, if this object were lined up in a way that's against the light, I can see the light, but it's a little bit lost. If I took this object and I moved it ever so subtly over here, suddenly this shadow is now allowing me to see that particular light. That suddenly is kind of a lucky two birds with one stone. In other words, I can still see the relationship of the form. I'm seeing some interesting patterns, but I'm also by just a few quarters of an inch able to see light on a form because of the shadow behind it, when with a different move I might not have been able to see that. So here's a painting, and I would say that this is a painting by a student that one would say is terrific. It's beautifully crafted. There are a lot of subtle tones. You can certainly feel the weight of the object. It's a nice still life, nice rhythm, but this is not what I'm going to ask for. The reason this is not what I'm going to ask for is not simply because the examples I'm going to show you are less blended. Yes, the examples I'm going to show you are less blended, but it's not a matter of blending. What I want you to see is the strong reflective light that's here, the strong reflective light that's here, the strong reflective light that's here, and here even, and that this stylistically shows a lot of edges of forms which we like to see. We think it's the proper details to see, but what I would like to show you that in life we don't see, and what I'd like to show you is a way to unify a painting by having lost edges, not showing all these edges. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Here's an example of a student project. These are both paintings, that came from the web. And this is obviously a basic design, and it's obviously a still life, and obviously the instructor said with two values, white and black only, describe this still life. This is a pretty nice example. You can see that, yes, that's a roll of toilet paper. Yes, that must be a box. Yes, that roll of toilet paper must be sitting inside the box. That's a coffee cup. That's some kind of coffee mug. In other words, you can recognize most of these objects. How did this artist do that with only two values? Well, it turns out that our mind will catch a lot of things. Just like, for example, when you look at a snowman, all you see are two eyes, maybe a carrot for a nose, and you've got it. You know that that's a face. We as humans recognize certain shapes, especially when they're familiar to us, very easily. We only need a hint in order to get the rest of the form. So in this case, a box has no edge here, but because we've seen so much of this vertical, we already understand that this must be a box. We're also looking at where this dark is and where that dark is. The implication is that here is a corner and here is a corner. That has perspective in it. That perspective is actually being repeated right in here. So between this little detail and that corner as details, we have the whole perspective, simple as it is, of that side of the box. Here you have a curve. Here you have a curve that speaks even more clearly about a full circle. Here you have one that speaks even less clearly about a full circle. Between this one that speaks almost entirely about a full circle, this one that speaks pretty firmly about the circle, and this one that just echoes and speaks very little about it, we understand that that is a common object, a roll of toilet paper. If the artist, for instance, didn't pick up on that edge, if the artist, for instance, saw this shadow, but the edge was lost here, suddenly this circle is its own object, but not part of a bigger form. So there's some smart thinking going on in this particular scenario. Let's come on down to this scenario. It's interesting to me that this edge is lost, this edge is found, this edge is lost, this edge is found, this edge is lost, this edge is lost, but this edge, which is so important to identify this as a teacup, is found. We see this edge, this edge, this edge. Let's take a look at the fact that there is an ellipse being read right here. Because this is being seen and then this is being seen. One is black against white, the other is white against black, but that entire edge can be seen. Here's the back, and just with this, it's enough for us to lose that particular edge. Or just with this lip right in here, that's just enough for us to understand that our eye should go that way, and we complete that shape. In this project, we're going to be asking you to make some series of grays. Right here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 grays. There's probably white over here, 9. You can see the black and white paint, and you can see the beginning of grays being met. We're not going to use 9 grays. We're only going to use 3. Maybe we'll come up to 5, but right now we're only going to use 3. A little bit like this. A light, a middle, a dark. This is a little bit more gray, so of course there's some more gray in here. Okay, so this is a bit more, a little bit closer of an example of what we might do. You have blocks, you have shapes of different types, and here there's only a white, a gray, and a black. Here there's more values, but right now we're going to start with just a white, a gray, and a dark. It doesn't have to be pitch black. In other words, you can find the values, if you're only going to use 3 values, you can find the 3 values that are closest to what you're seeing. And pitch black might not be a proper value. More than likely it'll be a white, a light gray, and maybe a dark gray. I'm going to continue this conversation about edges and make some things hopefully a little bit clearer. Here we have a complicated object, and I want to show you this object because in some ways this object is being double lit. It has a light source, a main light source from a light bulb that's just in the upper left, and that's causing a shadow. But my room also is lit. I have windows off to the right, to the left. As is the case with our studio, we have light coming in from windows up above. And in this case, I have that light coming in here, and you can see some areas that are being almost what we might say double lit. And this makes for some things that are a bit more complicated. For example, the shadow right here is a pretty strong shadow. So is the shadow down in here. So is the shadow there and there. But the shadows here, the shadow here, less strong. And you can almost see with my hand that if I blocked the window light, whoops, basically you would get slightly different shadows. In painting, artists actually love this kind of double light. I'll take a moment to go off in a sidebar and show you that if I took this, which is yellow, and showed it here, all of a sudden this area has changed color completely. From what looks bluish to what is orange. If I had this and I put it here, I would have a different kind of color, maybe a bit reddish, versus the yellow. And these are details that when we get into color should be a whole lot of fun. But back to what I wanted to explore here. We have lots of different choices here. If I put this dark back here, what I want you to see is this particular edge. We started to see in the last version how edges can come up very sharp and clean, or edges can be softer, not as extreme. Sometimes, however, you'll have an edge where you can barely see, if you squint your eyes, what the difference is. This might be a little bit too dark, a little closer to the black. But my point is to take these and move them around and start to show you how, depending on what you use, you can see certain edges more clearly and sometimes not so clearly. Okay, so now I have a choice to paint this. And on the one hand, the part of me who loves detail wants to go in and wants to make choices where I can see that and that, that and that, all of this, and plus I even want to be able to see that. But I've only got 3 values. Or even if I had 5 values, I would want to tell you that this detail, this little line, these little lighter, darker relationships aren't necessarily going to give me the nicest and easiest reading of this particular form. Instead, what I want you to do is squint your eyes and realize that if we want the light to come from this direction, I could take this shadow, join it with this shadow, and have this whole area be in shadow, and that might give me a more solid reading of this particular light shape and or this particular light shape, i.e. that maybe by sacrificing right in here, I get more of a unified idea of what this form is and where the light is hitting and where the shadow is. If I look down in here, I have something that's darker and something that's lighter. If I look over here, I have something that's darker and I have something that's lighter. This is where I need to make a choice. If I made this all dark, well, then it would blend maybe right in with this. Do I have enough of this form, the box part of this form, to read that I could actually connect this shadow with this shadow and lose all that detail? Well, actually, if I keep this towards the dark, this light would actually show this edge more. And so maybe I could get away with this. But what if I chose to have this as my background? Or what if I chose to make that as my background? My point here is that if you adjust things slightly, fib even a little bit, you're doing it for the sake of making the form easier to read. Simplicity is difficult, but this is about simplicity. The last thing I want to mention is right in here. Just like the handle on a teacup, the little zigzag of light and dark right here is actually something that's kind of what would we say? I don't know, kind of a proper detail to pick up on about this form. I would say that maybe making a dark shadow that zigzags here to sort of talk about the screw top is a more interesting detail, maybe more important detail than this little 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch divot in the plastic. Again, these are things that you have choices to make. Okay, so here we are back at this image that I showed you, one that has more values, and of course the more values is easier, but one that has less values, and the less values is the more challenging, and it is what I'd like us all to start with. Here is a painting that also has less values, 3 values, and what I'd really like you to see is something that occurred to me later. It took me a minute to figure this piece out. What I'd like you to see is this area right in here and how light it is. But surprise, surprise, come on over here and you know, I know that this area should be just as light as that, but the artist chose not to make it as light as that. She made 2 different values. You can see how the value is being lost here, And you can see, I think, a really important distinction where the artist chose to show that corner and have that line up with this. Pretty important for you to get all of this form. Here, it's very white. Why did the artist choose to have this be a lighter gray and this be more white? Why did the artist choose to lose this edge and this edge? Is it possible that this form was moved slightly in order to take advantage of that dark shadow? Right in here, it seems to me that there's wonderful economy. This dark leads to this dark, comes back to this dark. All the darks kind of link and hold together. This shape seems to be a lot like this shape. You move from here to here and then up to this vertical. That's very nice. I think that the artist downplayed this a little bit so that your reading was more clear this direction. My point with all of this is that there are lots of choices going on here that are more interesting than you would think, and I'm hoping that you all take advantage of these ideas.